Hello, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Helen Soslowski. I'm the events director for Oblong Books. If you're not familiar with Oblong, we have two independent bookstores based in Rhinebeck and Millerton in New York's Hudson Valley. Before we introduce our guests this evening, if you have any questions at any time during the program, please type them in the chat or in the Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen, and they'll be addressed at the end of the program or in the middle of the program or whenever our participants feel they're ready to open things up to questions. Signed copies of our country friends are available at oblongbooks.com. For those of you who prefer to listen to their literature, we also have the audiobook, which is narrated by Rob Shapiro, and links for both the signed books and the audiobook are available in the chat. We are very pleased this evening to be joined by New York Times bestselling author Gary Shteyngart. We'll be talking about his new novel, Our Country Friends, with author Darin Strauss. Our Country Friends has been hailed as a virtuoso performance by USA Today, and the Washington Post called it an homage to Chekhov with 4 romances and a finale that'll break your heart. Conducting the conversation with Gary this evening is best-selling author Darin Strauss. Welcome, Darin, whose work has earned a number of awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He is the author of the 2011 autobiography Half a Life, which won the NBCC Award for Memoir, and he currently teaches as clinical professor of creative writing at NYU. And with that, I will hand over to Darin.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be introducing Gary. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll just start by saying I think Gary Shteyngart may be, pound for pound, the best writer of our generation. I mean, he's not the biggest guy, and I haven't weighed myself or Zadie Smith, more to the point lately, but I think it's true. No one can do more than Gary can. He's like a 3-tool player in the NBA, but instead of pass, shoot, rebound, it's, I don't know, joke, simile, make you cry. He can be as funny as Saunders. He can work a big canvas like Friends, and he can be lyrically pyrotechnic like Shaban. He can go as far out there as Lethem. He can pull you up short like Zadie. He can hit as hard as Colson Whitehead. So yeah, I think he can do anything. And this new one, Our Country Friends, though I haven't quite finished yet, I just got it in the mail. I think it's up there with his best. Somehow he managed a masterpiece pandemic novel during the pandemic. I mean, I guess he has those maskless, unvaxxed jackasses to thank for dragging all this on so he could make his deadline. But Our Country Friends is moving and spirited and funny and sad and fun and great. So it's a real pleasure to be here talking to Gary about it. Hello, Gary.
Hi, Darin. So great to see you again, and thank you for that really wonderful introduction. I am not worthy, but I really appreciate all those very kind words and comparisons to our generation's best. And I am a huge fan of your work. I've read it since Chang and Eng, right? I read it since the moment.
Yeah, well, we've known each other a long time.
Yeah, we go back. You know, in literary circles in New York can be pretty competitive, but we're nice friends.
Yeah,
So.
I don't think that's true. I mean, they say it's true, but everyone seems pretty nice, you know? I mean, maybe.
You're right. I mean, I remember when I was starting out, things were a little more, it was still that transitional period where Norman Mailer was still alive. So,
Right.
you know, you could still go to a party and he would punch you.
You wouldn't feel it because he was old at that point.
Yeah, he was pretty old at that point. So it was more like
Yeah, it was like
you'd let him push your chin a little bit. But yes, today, most writing parties, as you know, it's just a bunch of people drinking cheap white wine and talking about health insurance. So
well, I was really changed. Were you at that? There was an event, and then we'll get to your book, but there was an event a long time ago where Richard Ford spit on Colson Whitehead.
I've heard about it. I have not witnessed this event, but
I was there. It was I can't remember. It wasn't a party. It was some, I don't know, some pen thing or something. But what was interesting was Colson had the greatest comeback. So Colson had given a bad review to Richard Ford. Richard Ford came over and spit on him. And then Page 6 heard about it. So the New York Post called him. and he said, they said, "Do you have a comment?" And he said, well, "You know what? I've been around a lot of old people. I'm used to them drooling on me." So that was, I
Oh,
think,
oh, that's horrifying.
pretty
Oh
good.
my gosh.
Yeah, pretty
Well,
good.
I am so lucky never to have been spit upon. I've never done any spitting. I've missed out on all those
Yeah,
fun
well,
things.
I've eaten near you. Maybe not intentionally, but okay. So, well, let's get to the book. So, I joked about this being a pandemic book during the pandemic, but it is amazing that you did this so quickly. How did the process change? I mean, or did it change? It just seemed like it has a real kinetic energy that seems like something that was
Mhm.
done at speed.
Yes, it was really much done at speed. So what was happening, and you'll like this part because you teach at NYU, is I had started out writing a dystopian, very humorous dystopian novel about a future in which most of Manhattan was taken over by NYU. Uh, yes, exactly. And so instead of blue helmets, the troops wore like violet helmets. It's violet, right? Or
Yeah, something.
something
Yeah.
like that. Yes,
Right.
exactly. So
Dude, I
yeah, it
have
was
to wear this contractually.
exactly. So, it was that kind of comedy, like sort of a farce about futuristic academia and dystopia. I myself also teach, but not NYU. So I was working on that, and the ha-has were coming. It was pretty funny, I thought. And then the pandemic began, and I guess coming from the Soviet Union, I have this very I'm just very attuned to disaster on a societal scale because
Mm.
I saw the Soviet Union fall apart before my eyes when I was a teeny weeny kid. So I'm kind of pre-programmed to see things go to hell.
Wait,
And
can I ask you how old you
sure,
were when you came here and what
I came
year?
here at seven in 1979. So
So
yeah,
pre Glasnost.
pre-Glasnost, yes, it was the depth of the Brezhnev era. We were all telling Brezhnev jokes because he was very senile at that point, and actually was drooling at many events. For me, I kind of feel like when the pandemic started, the first thought I had is this is not going to be over anytime soon. And this became a concern when people said, "You're writing a novel about the pandemic, it's going to be over by September, it'll just be a little, flash in the pan." But I had a feeling it would go on for quite a while because I kind of see um, um, sorry, somebody's asking me to tilt my head more so I won't be glaring. Oh boy. Okay. Is this better? Look at this. People are very vocal about glare. Okay. How about this? Less glare. Can you see my eyes? I can even take my
You look
glasses
great.
off.
Yeah.
How about this? Yeah. Now you can see the rings under my eyes. Oh boy. So yes, so I began to write the book in late March, I would say, right around the end of March, early April, because I thought that my NYU novel was just being overtaken by
2020.
in 2020, correct. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so because I thought we were being overtaken by events, so it was time to get with the real dystopia. And especially not just the pandemic, but also the fact that the government was completely incompetent. We had another president at that point, as you may remember, and things were really falling apart. And that kind of confluence of both a tragic, a viral event combined with a political disaster, I thought was inspirational in helping me write Our Country Friends. But just to caution, I mean, the book is a pandemic novel in some ways, but the pandemic is more of a background, I think,
Right.
to a novel about friendship and other.
Yeah. I should say it's not a zombie novel or something where it's very much. I mean, it keeps getting compared to Chekhov. Was that intentional? To me, it did feel very Russian, and down to the beginning, you have the dramatis personae. But
Yes.
I was getting sort of Tolstoy vibes.
That's interesting. I mean, look, I appreciate, as a Russian, I appreciate Chekhov and Tolstoy comparisons of any sort. I think the New York Times said that I'm Tolstoyan in the way I access the consciousness of animals in this book, and I do a couple of animal interiors. But I mean, come on, I am no Chekhov or Tolstoy. This reminds me of a funny joke. When I was a kid in a yeshiva as a child, when I came to America, there was a parents teachers conference, and one of the teachers said, "Oh, we hear Gary reads Tolstoy in the Russian original." And my father said, "No, only Chekhov." So there's a clear, Tolstoy is here, Chekhov is here, but I certainly do appreciate both of those comparisons. But I would say that that Chekhov was the biggest influence, because I began to read his short stories when the quarantine began. I was living entirely upstate near Rhinebeck. Hi, Rhinebeck people. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, I have Our Country Friends, the wine, right, which is a lovely Riesling made in very small quantities by Millbrook, the vineyard. Ask them to make more of them. It's a lovely Riesling. It's a very fruity with a hint of friendship.
And we should show the cover, that the cover matches the Riesling.
That's the beauty of it. Yeah.
You should
exactly right.
Next time you should do Budweiser and get sponsored.
Yeah, Budweiser, Our Country Friends. Yeah, Our Country Friends. That could work with Budweiser's whole MO. Yeah, so I was reading a lot of Chekhov stories. There's like 3 or 4 of them that are based very much, they're kind of in the country. So there's one about love, there's gooseberries, there's I'm thinking of the English translation, In the Banya maybe is one of them, and Man in the Shell, a man in the shell, I think would be how it would be said in English. And they were lovely because they were all about people in the country talking about other people in the country. It was this kind of meta effect that Chekhov does. So 3 men get together, they go to the banya, the bathhouse, they start shooting vodka, and at the same time they're gossiping about some other guy who's not there and whatever happened to him. But what I loved about those stories is that they were about friends who are in their 40s, much like the characters in my book, who are looking, this is old enough where you can look back at your life and say, well, I did this right, I did this wrong. So it's a time of both taking stock and a time of regrets. So so the pandemic in some ways is a device that puts all of these people, it's a kind of, who was it? I think it was my publicist, like, it's Chekhov meets Big Chill. And I love that comparison, right? It sounds hilarious, but I love the Big Chill as a kid. I would watch it incessantly. So there's something in the Big Chill. Of course, it's a suicide of a classmate that forces all these former University of Michigan classmates together. So yes, and somebody put up Millbrook wine, very good. Yes. But in this case, it is the pandemic that forces all these former classmates of math and science high school, like the one I went to, Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, forces many of them to come back together.
Well, I have questions about how autobiographical it is, which is the most annoying question a writer can ask another writer. But before we get to that, I thought it was brilliantly structured too, in that it's not just friends, it's friends and one nemesis, which is
one enemy. Yes,
I think a real twist on the formula, which really, from the jump, makes great drama, because we want to know, well, who is the nemesis, and why is the nemesis a nemesis? So kudos to that.
Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, the friends themselves have many things to work out. There's a betrayal that happened a long time ago. There's unrequited love, and each one of them is different in terms of how successful they are. One has become a billionaire through this app that she's made. Another is the main character, Senderovsky, who owns this estate near Rhinebeck, where everyone goes, is a failing Russian novelist. Where did I come up with that? Okay, right. And some are more successful than others. But then there's a nemesis who is an actor, and he's known simply as the actor. His name is not revealed until the very end of the book, and it's a very prosaic name. But he is sort of the hand grenade that's tossed into this circle of friends. And he is writing a script with Senderovsky, and Senderovsky is running out of money, and he desperately needs a major network to approve of this script. And so the actor rolls in to spend the pandemic with him and finish the script up. But of course, this leads to all sorts of horrifying love triangles and terrible things in general.
A number of reviews have said, and Rushdie on the back said, it's your most moving novel. Do you feel that maybe tying into, well, first of all, do you feel that there seems like maybe a different level of, the humor is still there, but there seems maybe a different level of warmth to it? Is that a fair assessment, you think?
Maybe so. I mean, I think this is the condition of mellowing out a little bit as I age. When I wrote my first books, especially Absurdistan and maybe even my first book, Russian Debutante's Handbook, I was a pretty angry guy. I mean, I was growing up in an immigrant family where relationships weren't always copacetic. There was a lot of friction. I was not, my assimilation into this country was very difficult, and I still felt the scars of all of these things and was very angry on a personal level, on a societal level. And I think that led to a kind of satire, and I stand by those books, as we like to say now. It's a timestamp in history, whenever we read stuff that's a little strange by today's standards. But at the same time, right now, especially since I became a father 8 years ago, and especially since I started spending almost way more than half of my time upstate New York, that we moved there about 11 years ago, I have found myself mellowing. So yes, it's probably distance from my unhappy youth, and also distance from New York City a little bit, that has made me a mellower kind of person. And I think that's reflected in my love of the characters.
Yeah. Well, so I hinted at it, so let me maybe ask outright: how autobiographical is this novel? Are you comfortable talking about that?
Sure. And this is, by the way, a really good wine. I'm having a sip. I wish I could share some with all of you. It really goes down easy.
You're getting a little close. Let me just hold on.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay,
I love it.
Yeah.
That's very funny. Yeah, I think that it's what I usually like to do with my characters is I will take someone and make them even more so than they are, So there's an interior nebbish inside me, and what I like to do is make that nebbish bigger for my work,
Right.
I try to think of the nebbish I was when I got to this country, and I couldn't tie my shoes. I didn't know the language. I was circumcised a month after I got here very badly. I mean, it all kind of went downhill very fast. And I want to project that nebbish onto a character that some people will rightfully identify with me. So here, there is a character like that. But this is not one of my sort of novels where there's one main protagonist. There's 8 protagonists here. They're from all over the world. One is from Korea.
Ed is a great character. I'm wondering, is there a real life analog to Ed?
There's a couple of analogs to Ed, who is this dandy who is the son of a chaebol family. A chaebol is in Korea. It's like a gigantic corporation. Think of Samsung, for example. There's a couple of them that control vast segments of Korean industry. So yes, there are several analogs to Ed. I'll give you an example of how I work and how I think you probably work and most novelists work, in that we're constantly looking out for little ticks and features. Dickens was very good at this, obviously. So for example, for Ed, the feature that I loved, I had a friend, a Korean friend from I think a fairly wealthy family, who always, when he talked, he would always cup his ear when he talked. And I think it was this very nervous tick, and he especially did this if there was an attractive woman he was talking to. So you would constantly do this as if he was communicating by satellite with some other entity, like, hello, Earth. Earth.
What's so great about that in the book, you read about that detail so well, and it stuck with me, because you say he knew that he did it when he was nervous and he couldn't stop doing it. And I think that we all have those things where you just say, I'm fucking doing it now. I'm grabbing the ear. I'm talking to the girl.
See, but just to go back to what you were saying earlier about sort of the mellowing, if I had been writing this 20 years ago, I would have used that detail of him doing this with the ear and just made fun of it. It's funny that somebody does that. But now I think with a little bit more age and empathy, I will note the fact that he himself knows that he does it. And that adds, I think, a little bit of, that makes the character less pathetic in some ways, less a subject of humor, and more, somebody that we can relate to, as you were saying, because we all have these little ticks. So why, if we're laughing at him, we may as well also be laughing at ourselves. Nabokov, one of my favorite books is Nabokov's Pnin, which I even prefer to Lolita. And Nabokov portrays Pnin. He's a Russian professor at a small university in upstate New York, of course, probably modeled on Cornell, where Nabokov taught. But he makes that character very, we're always laughing at him throughout. But by the end of the book, he makes us feel as we are complicit in other bullies who have made fun of him throughout Pnin's life. And that's not exactly what I'm going for here, but I think I also want to create less distance between the reader and these characters than I usually would.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite of his too, I think. And the interesting thing there is that the sort of villain character at the end who was a bully his whole life, seems like it's Nabokov himself, right?
Exactly. The bully at the end of Pnin is Nabokov himself. And so, and that's wonderful to do, because Nabokov really puts himself out as somebody who also has participated in cruelty, as we all have.
Do you, just going back to the Russian models for this book, do you read, when you said during the pandemic, you were reading Chekhov, are you reading like Garnett translations, or are you going straight to the Russian?
I would read both the Russian, and sometimes I would read the latest translation just because I was trying to get myself in the mood in terms of the English as well. Those are two very different things. I often read in Russian just to recreate the rhythms of the language. And then it's also good to see how very good translators who know how to translate from Russian to English will do with that kind of, will do with that. So it's a great new translation. Yeah, I mean, and just being in the country and sitting on a porch and reading Chekhov, I think it's the greatest thing one can do with one's life. There really is nothing better. Maybe adding a little bit of something good to drink with it. Otherwise, it's just perfection.
Yeah, Our Country Friend by Budweiser.
Oh my gosh, yes.
No, it's funny because I love Russian literature, and I think one of my great regrets is I don't speak Russian. I would love to know what it's like in the original. And in fact, I love Babel. I think you said you were a fan of Babel too, right?
Sure, of course. The Benya Creek stories and things.
Yeah, incredible. But I love the old translation. And then there was a big to-do in like 2005 or something when they had this new translation. I didn't like it at all. And I thought maybe it's more accurate. I just like the translator, or maybe the new.
I think what Russian allows is it allows for a kind of, there's a lot of diminutives, you know, you wouldn't be Darin, you'd be Darinchka. Well, you know, there's a sweeter way to refer to one another. There's a kind of, it's an unkind society, but the language often allows for a kind of kindness, which I find beautiful, and which definitely is a soundtrack that I put on whenever I write about Russian characters.
Can you write in Russian fiction? I mean,
not that well. No, it would be very hard to do so.
You oversee the translations into Russian?
Nope. Usually I scan, you know, like a chapter or two to make sure that they get the gist of it. The difficulty is finding someone who is well, obviously it's somebody who's a native Russian speaker, but also someone who knows the latest in American lingo and British lingo, and somebody who can translate well in that regard.
Oh yeah, I've caught some real doozies that mistranslations of my own stuff.
Yes, I'm sure.
So there's a couple of Q&A questions, so let me just open it up so people don't get upset here. Nigel Wright asks, you're being compared to Chekhov right now with your latest novel. Another writer, Raymond Carver, is sort of known as the American Chekhov. I'm wondering, have you seen any similarities between yourself and Carver? That's a stretch, right?
It's a very interesting thought. You know, when I went to college at the Oberlin Institute for Special Individuals, there was a professor who was a disciple of Gordon Lish, who is a very famous editor, and who very famously edited Raymond Carver. And there was a kind of Gordon Lish method where everyone went around the room, and if you said if you started reading your story, and if one word didn't sound honest, you had to stop, and it would move on to another person. So, you know, I'd open up my book and I'd say and the professor would say, no, that's not honest, Gary. We have to stop. You don't start with the article like that. So, so there's a lot of, there was a lot of Raymond Carver / Gordon Lish kind of stuff happening in the, I would guess in the 80s, early 90s. I think he was probably the most influential writer in terms of younger writers. Yes, I think some of it obviously trickled through because he was so dominant then. I'm a maximalist writer as opposed to minimalist. These minimalist, maximalist terms are I think way overrated. But yes, I do sometimes. What Gordon Lish did well is he cut out words that didn't belong there, and he took it, and his disciples took it to a ridiculous extreme. But I'm always looking at a sentence thinking, do we need this? Do we need that word? And I think that's a very important skill for writers to have. And I'm sure you do the same with your students.
There's a great quote. I like Carver, but I also, being same age as you, I think would also sort of recoil from how dominant he was. There's a great line from Updike, who was more of a maximalist than he was, and he said it's easy to be a minimalist. He said about minimalists, he said it's easy to take a vow of poverty if you have no money in your pocket anyway. Which is pretty cool.
Ouch, that is very cool. See what I mean about writers having...
Yeah, I think, There was a bigger pie. By the time we got there, the pie was so small. We're not going to fight over the crumbs. I
That's
don't.
true. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The pie was
Deborah
small.
Copps asked, you mentioned Yiddish lingo. Is there Yiddish in this novel?
I don't know. I think probably. I think there's Yiddish in every novel that I've ever written. I'm sure the word schmuck or putz has definitely made it in there. I mean, it would be. I would probably ask for. My publisher would ask for my advance back if I didn't put any Yiddishisms in there. But it's. You know, two characters are Jewish. Senderovsky, the main character, and his wife Masha, who's a psychiatrist. They're both Russian Jews, and Masha practices some aspects of Judaism. She lights the Sabbath candles, for example. And her husband is a very big atheist, and so there's obviously some fights about that. But there's not as much of Jewish culture as in some other books of mine, but there's definitely some because those two characters are Jewish.
Well, maybe that's one of the reasons it feels Russian and warm and expansive is because, as you mentioned, there's not, unlike some of your other books, it doesn't focus on the character who seems like a stand-in for the author. There are many characters, all different, all very rich. I mean, richly portrayed. Not
Some are rich, yeah.
Some are rich,
yeah.
some are not rich.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another thing that I think has crept into your work lately, especially in the last couple of books. A real nuanced look at class, which is such an important part of America now.
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we live in a country where, I mean, this is probably the most competitive society that exists in the North American European sphere. You know, as people know who have lived in, for example, Italy or France, you don't start out by saying, you know, well, what do? You know, there's so many other more interesting things that one can talk about, but we are a very competitive society. And my characters are immigrants who have been raised to compete from day one. You know, the constant refrain that parents have, we brought you here, you know, we gave up everything to bring you here, so you're going to be very successful. There's no choice but to succeed. So yes, and by this point, you know, there's such a vast gulf between the different characters. There's one who's a near billionaire who is the app inventor. There's Senderovsky, who started out fairly wealthy as a successful writer. Now his books aren't selling well, and his you know, his scripts aren't getting made in Hollywood, so everything's starting to fall apart for him. Then there's his friend Vanud, who's very unsuccessful and is working as a short order cook at his uncle's restaurant in Jackson Heights, Queens. So there's a wide, you know, there's constant flashbacks to who they were as kids when they were teenagers, when there was a very level playing field. They were all poor kids of poor immigrants going to this very fancy math and science high school. But by this point, you know, the society has given every one of them a ranking, if you will, you know, like an Amazon ranking or any other kind of ranking. And they're trying to renegotiate their relationships. But there's always that background of some were more successful than others and the jealousy that ensues with that. And I think any novel about people reaching middle age or older age encompasses that, especially in a country like America, where there's such a divergence between failure and success. You know, when I was growing up here and we were very poor on a kind of government cheese level of poor, you know, people treated me badly, and it almost felt like in this country being poor wasn't just a state, even for a small child. It was more like a moral judgment, almost like a kind of, you know, Calvinist predestination. Something was done wrong by you or your ancestors for you to find yourself in this position, you know.
Other kids would treat you poorly because your family didn't have money.
Oh, of course. I went to a school that was more middle to upper middle class, and we were completely broke, and that was a very painful condition. You know.
Is it Stuyvesant you're talking about, or just?
No. Oh, Stuyvesant. No, Stuyvesant was great. That was high school. I'm talking about elementary school. No, Stuyvesant. Everybody, you know, came from Flushing or Chinatown or whatever, and we were all our parents were sort of, you know, poor to middling. But the school I went to in sort of the eastern parts of Queens, closer to Great Neck and all those other parts of the island,
I was actually born. I was born in Little Neck, so yeah.
That's where I grew up, Little Neck in part. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're both Little Neckers.
I was only there for like 10 minutes. Literally born there and taken out. But what's funny, you went, because, you know, I come from a Jewish background, but not immigrant. But even there, my family really was not into the idea of me being a writer. They were not supportive at all. And now, again, after a couple of books, they pretend that they always were supportive, as I'm sure.
Books, a couple of prizes, yeah.
But you how did they take it when you said you were going to be a writer, and how long did it take them to accept it and be proud, or has it always been a thorn?
It's a complicated question. At first, they were shocked that I would do this, and they said, writing is a really good hobby. It looks good on your college resume. You should always write, but you should also be, and my mother wanted me to be a CPA, which is so strange because I really don't know how to add two small numbers together. It's just not in my blood to be a CPA. Then they wanted me to be a lawyer. I mean, they had all these very traditional immigrant goals for me. When I became a writer, they were very unconvinced. When my first book came out, when I got a job at Columbia teaching, they said, "Okay, so you're a professor. That makes sense. That's a real job.
Okay.
That's okay then." But then, of course, and because I write so intimately about families that aren't entirely dissimilar from our own, it hurts them very much. Some of my political opinions, they're like most Soviet immigrants, very far to the right. I, of course, am not. So stuff like that obviously creates a lot of friction between. And when I do signings, and I did a signing yesterday in real life, it was amazing. I haven't done that in 2 years. People came, a lot of Russians came and said, "That's exactly my parents that you write about." And to me, that's so interesting because I always thought my parents were uniquely interesting in their own way, like that Tolstoy family is unhappy in its own way. But everyone always says to me, "Well, no, my parents do exactly the same things that the parents do in your novels," which is strange. And the characters in this book, the immigrant characters, argue about how much of their parents is the fact that they are who they are, or that they were shaped by history in a very unique way. The Korean immigrants had to deal with the Japanese occupation 100 years ago, and the civil war between North and South Korea. Chinese immigrants had to deal with the Cultural Revolution. Indian immigrants with partition. Russian immigrants with Hitler and Stalin and all of that. So, but they asked the characters in my book asked the same question: how much of our parents is who they are naturally and by the way they were raised, and how much of it was just this giant sweep of history? And when I talk to fellow Russian immigrants, the answer seems to be, well, history kind of swept them all in a similar way. For example, now many Russian immigrants, many of our parents won't take the COVID vaccine because the sources that they watch, both Russian television, Russian state television, and Tucker Carlson, etc., tell them, don't do it, it'll kill you. So many of them haven't taken the vaccine. And I would think, well, that's very unique to my parents, but then it turns out not unique at all.
Wow. I hadn't thought about that. Yes, and yesterday you did this public event. That must have been fun. So, I mean, I had a book come out in last year that in the height of it, and so that all the events were canceled. It was a sort of a heartbreak.
I feel that is very heartbreaking, and I mean, because as you know, and going out to meet readers after you've toiled away on a book for a couple of years is just so wonderful. I mean, readers are the reason we're doing this, obviously. People always ask, well, would you write if you had no readership? I guess I would, but it would be more journaling than trying to create the kind of works that I create, and I'm sure that you create. So it was really great that my live tour is very truncated, just a couple of cities because of COVID. But as wonderful as it is to see all of you on a screen, it's really something when we meet and you offer me a book to sign and we'll chat for a little bit, and that's just a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Oh, so a couple other questions. One quick one from Richard Cohen. He says, Myron Road in Westbury. What's the connection in that to that address in Super Sad?
No, so and you probably do this too. For research, I decided to set my characters as deep in Long Island as I could find. This is a Super Sad true love story, and so I went to Westbury, which is very much in the center of Long Island, and I at least of Nassau County, and I just started driving around with. She wasn't my wife then; she was just my girlfriend. But I was like, honey, I want to research something. Can you? And I didn't even know how to drive. I just moved upstate 10 years ago, and I just learned how to drive very recently. So if you're upstate and you see a black Volvo coming at you, although that's every other car upstate, watch out, because I'm still learning how to do it.
That's
But
a funny
yes,
part of the book too. The
yes,
the
Sasha,
driving.
the main character, also is a terrible driver. But yes, so she drove me out to Westbury, and I was just looking for roads or streets rather that had names that I liked. And you know how it is as a writer, you like
Yeah, yeah.
one name more than another. And I think Myron, for some reason, appealed to me. Myoron. It's an interesting kind of. I have a Y in my last name, Shteyngart, so I'm always partial to Ys. So I included it for that reason and no other. There's no other significance.
Elizabeth asks, you had a piece in the New Yorker recently about an intimate topic.
Yeah.
How did it feel to write about such a very personal subject? Do you want to talk about that, or?
I sure can. Yes. I mean, you know, ask me about my botched circumcision. Yes. The New Yorker article, which is, it's interesting because actually a lot of women have read this article and come up to me to talk about it. And men tell me I just can't read it. I mean, the graphic alone on that article is worth looking up. The article is called "My Gentile Region." That's the name of it, and it's in the. You can find it online on the New Yorker or read it in print. Yes. So last year I was, as I mentioned, when I was 7, I was circumcised very badly by these Chabadniks, followers of Lubavitcher rabbi, and I was in pain for years after coming to America as a little kid. And then last year there was a complication to that surgery, and I was in terrifying pain for about a year, and I could barely move. I had to wear like like an Elizabethan collar around the genital. But it's all absolutely insane. All of this stuff is completely crazy. It made a huge impact on the book I was writing on Our Country Friends, because about 3/4 of the way in is where this pain began, and I think it began to influence the ending of the book, where a certain character, without spoiling anything, also goes through some terrible pain. I decided to write about it because I think it's an experience. What I learned, but just by talking to friends, was that there were quite a few people who had botched circumcisions. This is not a topic that's very readily talked about, but it was a topic that began to come up. And today, after publishing this article, my inbox is filled with men who have had difficulties after their circumcisions, mothers whose kids were born very recently and who have had botched circumcisions, rabbis who are interested in talking to me and maybe sort of reconsidering whether or not they want to recommend circumcision to every one of their congregants, maybe make it less of a commandment and more of a choice. I think there's that kind of movement. And Johns Hopkins, the medical school, just contacted me and wants me to present on my penis to the medical faculty. So that will be interesting.
That could be for a whole other reason.
Yeah. Yes, they've heard such good things about it, right? So they want me to come down, come down to Baltimore, and I guess just come up to the podium and drop my pants and see what happens.
Do you both have to go, or can you stay home and your penis can just?
Yeah, one of my favorite short stories is The Nose, Gogol's story, where the nose runs away from the main character and begins to lead a life all its own. Yeah, absolutely. I also see someone in the chat says that Salman Schachter is not a yeshiva, it's a conservative school. Yes, exactly. I'm sorry, I call it a yeshiva just as an easy way of saying that, but no, it's a conservative day school, Hebrew day school.
Yeah. Any other questions from the crowd?
No, but I did see someone was asking about should everyone move to Kingston to become a writer? I think, was that a question?
Yes, or should everyone move upstate to become a writer?
The answer is absolutely yes, absolutely. I don't know how you can do it downstate. It doesn't seem feasible to me. I work probably twice.
You only wrote 4 books down here or something. So. But do you recommend? I mean, yeah. So how important now is upstate living to you, and do you consider yourself less a New Yorker and more an upstater now?
I do. I mean, I think learning to drive was such an important part of that. Honestly, I think part of being a New Yorker is not knowing how to drive, or not knowing how to drive well. So many of the friends I grew up with still don't know how to drive. So yeah, it's really exciting to I love even driving to like a strip mall in Kingston and buying those family-sized rolls of tissue and toilet paper, the ones that are as big as your whole body, and then cramming them into the back of the car. To me, that's America. You know, I'm an American now.
That's the great opening of the book. It's like a big upstate shopping
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. And those who live upstate, I'm sure will recognize many of the places in the greater Rhinebeck metropolitan area.
And so, yeah, so what is it, what is it about that part of the country that makes it easier to write in than say Brooklyn or Lower Manhattan?
I think the quiet is incredible. As I was writing Our Country Friends in the very depth of the pandemic, I would just walk outside and think, holy cow, I'm surrounded by nature. I mean, I had thought about that before, but without the human element present at all, it became so important, and I realized I don't even know what that tree is. What is that tree? And it was really funny. A lot of the writers that lived near me started, and myself included, started downloading all these apps to figure out what everything was. Oh, that's a groundhog. Oh, that, there's all these apps that capture the flora and fauna of upstate or many places. That's the moon. I was wondering, I used to scream at it because I thought it was too bright and I couldn't turn it down. But now I realize it's just a part of the natural landscape. It's the moon. Well, that's lovely, So that was the kind of thing that. But also just it's very calming. Right now people are telling us meditate, which is easier said than done. But even walking on a country road is a kind of meditation.
Well, the book, as we've said multiple times, is sort of well populated. And you said you were pretty much alone during the pandemic. So did you have friends to visit? And if not, did it sort of help keep you from being lonely? Because it's such a lonely time, but you're surrounded by 8 friends in your imagination all the time.
Yeah, and I wondered because I wasn't in New York, where I know people were keeping to themselves, obviously, but you could still probably wave to someone as you cross the street to go to the bodega. And what we did was we formed a small pod with some of my other friends in the area. And it was actually beautiful. We got to know each other. We were already very good friends, but we really became a kind of family. And we would get together every Sunday. We would get together to grill by the pool and stuff like that. And it just felt like this kind of Edenic American childhood I myself never had. Being next to a Dutch colonial, having a grill out. It was just, and obviously it's very much influenced what I was writing about. But that was such a great feeling. Obviously, it was a very small circle of friends, and I became very lonely for other friends from other parts of the world. And so I would walk down that country road of mine, which just like the road in Our Country Friends has a sheep farm right next to it. I would walk right past it, and I would imagine these 8 characters and imagine them walking down that road and wondering what they would say to one another and how they would react to each other. And that became a way for me to assuage my loneliness. I know everyone did very different ways to assuage their loneliness. So for me, I think there were 3 things that I did. There was reading Chekhov and other country writers or writers who write about the country. There was the pandemic friends, the pandemic pod, that I created. And the third thing was watching a Japanese reality show called Terrace House, which also features in the book, which I recommend for people who are, in a stressful situation, because it's about a group. It's sort of like a reality show about a group of 6, 7 Japanese men and women in their early 20s living in a house in Tokyo. But whereas in America, it would be just constant fights and hooking up and etc. Almost nothing happens. They're wonderful Japanese people who sit around, and maybe there's a conflict over soba noodles or something, but it's very small. And that show, even though it was set in Tokyo, which is one of the world's biggest cities, if not the biggest city, it kind of put me into this very sweet 19th century mood that was further reinforced by both my country walks and by constantly reading Chekhov. So that was the triple thing that went into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone had their own thing. I went back to my elementary school a lot just because that was a place we could run around with the kids, and I think that was my explanation. But I'm sure it was some sort of trying to capture some innocent time or something.
Yeah. Innocence, nostalgia. I think that's all stuff that played into it. I would call my friend in Germany, and we would remember little things from our childhood, like, we would watch television together and we would call each other and talk about what was on the screen on our landlines. It was such an innocent memory,
That's so great, yeah. First of all, before I ask NB's question here, I didn't know that Japanese show in the book was real. I thought that was a brilliant creation. So
See, I rarely use my imagination. Who needs an imagination when the world is so fascinating?
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Question here is, have you ever read something that compelled you to travel to its setting? If so, what was the piece?
Oh yeah, I read. I don't usually read crime novels, but for
Mm.
some reason I started reading a series of novels called Bangkok 8, Bangkok
Oh
6.
yeah, yeah.
Lancaster is the name of the writer. I don't know why. I think it was maybe. I think I was somewhere like an Airbnb or something, and it was lying there. And this is before iPhone, so I wasn't constantly, So I started, but I started reading it, and I've always wanted to go to Bangkok, but I didn't, There's so many other places to go to. But after reading it, I thought, oh my God, I have to get myself to Bangkok immediately. And back then, I had the best job ever. I don't know if you ever had a job like this. I was a contributing editor to Travel and Leisure.
Mm.
Uh, and I was in my early 30s. I just published my first book. I'd never had a job like this. This is when
Yeah.
Travel and Leisure was owned by American Express, and they would pay you gazillions of dollars, and the budget was endless. You could fly business wherever you wanted. And so I said, okay, I'm going to Bangkok. And I flew to Bangkok, and I fell in love with the city immediately. The food, the street life, everything was just incredible. And then at one point, I remember I was trying to write a spy novel, partly set in Bangkok, but I realized I really suck as a spy or thriller novelist, so I had to let it go. John Burdett, somebody
John
just
Burdett, yeah,
yes,
that's right.
John Burdett had
I've
that.
heard great things about that. My old writing teacher, Lee Abbott, used to love those books.
Uh-huh. Oh, I can see why. I can see why. Yeah, it's a very, he has, I know he's American, I think, or British, but there's a kind of Russian sort of fatalism about everything he writes, or maybe a Buddhist kind of fatalism that has seeped into him from all the time he spent living in Asia. It's really, really great.
Very practical question from Deborah Copps again. Do you outline or just go for it?
I used to outline a lot. Books like Absurdistan that are so plot driven that there's 300 different things that have to happen, X, Y, and Z. It's almost, I've worked in television writers' rooms where, a lot of it, I'm good at atmospherics, but the plotting often is a little bit above my pay grade. But, where ABC has to happen in order for D to happen, then D, E, F have to happen for G to happen. So a book like Absurdistan, which was very heavily plot driven, all this political and other machinations, yes, very heavily outlined. I think there was like 70 plot points that I had to get through. But with a book like this, no, not at all. I mean, I had an idea. I had 3 or 4 ideas about what would happen to the characters, each of the fates of the characters. And it's also structured like a 4-act play when you read this book. As you mentioned, in the first page is a dramatis personae. And so, yes, I pretty much set up my characters. And then like a playwright, it was all the things, the dialogue and the action that happens between them.
Was that your hardest book to write, you think, Absurdistan, in a way, just because it was so...
The hardest book to write in some ways was Little Failure, which was my memoir. And I think it was because, I had smoked a lot of pot at Stuyvesant, so my memory is not as great as it used to be. And I just going down all those paths was so difficult. Just really difficult to do that. And of course, yes, the article I had just written about my botched circumcision in the New Yorker was very difficult to write, although I know that writing is, I never think of writing as therapy. It has to be art. But there was something very cathartic when this horrible thing was happening to me. My wife obviously knew what was going on, and some of my best friends knew what was going on, but a lot of people didn't. So I felt like I was a fraud because I was constantly, I was teaching a class at Columbia on Zoom, and I wasn't able to, I was in such pain that often I would take a break, and the kids would be like, they're graduate students, the young adults would be like, well, we're paying all this money, are you really going to take a break now? And I would talk to them personally and say, look, I can't say what it is, but there's something going on and I need to take a break. But I also felt like I was a fraud and not representing myself, the reality of my situation. But writing that New Yorker piece was a way to say to the world, this is what happened, and and I just want to share it with you. But my friends were so sweet. A good friend of mine, Suketu Mehta, you probably know Suketu, I think he's at NYU as well. But he's in journalism. Sorry, he's not in creative writing. but he sent me these dhotis, these Indian garments that you wear like a sarong and you tie it off, and that was very helpful when you're sort of genitally mutilated. It's very nice to have stuff that's not, like underwear. It was,
Yeah.
so everyone took care of me, and that's what this book is sort of about in a way. It's about people taking care of each other without, having grown up without parents who could do that for them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would just get back to something you said, craft-wise. I always think that fiction and memoir are hard in different ways. Like, it's so hard to make stuff up, and you're always asking yourself, does it make sense? What follows next? So it seems like, memoir should be easier, but it's hard in its own way, because it has to both, you have to remember, as you said, but also it has to be interesting. Like, in a novel, you could always pull out a gun if you had to make it interesting, so.
Well, in your brilliant memoir, you actually you have a terrible inciting incident, sorry to use Hollywood speak, but you have a terrible inciting incident which provides a kind of framework to all that. And I tried to find one as well in Little Failure, and it was this time that my father punched me when I was a little kid. Became a kind of leitmotif for the entire novel. But so you're looking for something where you changed as a person. That's the most important thing. If you're looking at a memoir, or if you're looking at anything, you got to find that you got to find the thing that hurts the most. And again, going back to that New York article, it was very easy to pinpoint that pain. But for other, less for more abstract works, of course, you have to figure out what you're looking for.
Well, going back to the beginning of this talk, and as we're wrapping up, you mentioned Gordon Lish very early on. Lish, I once was talking to the writer Amy Hempel, and she said that she took a college class with Lish because he taught at Harvard, I guess.
Yes.
And he told this class of like freshmen, undergrads, write about the thing that's the most painful to you and really face it, and just write honestly about it. Whatever you don't want to face, that's what you should write about. And she said this is a class of 15 non-writers for the most part. And she said 8 of those people got their story published, even though most of them never went on to write again. Because if you can access that pain, there's something incredible.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to teach these days, because I know that we have to issue trigger warnings and other things. There's a lot of sort of but I think that where I teach it, in the MFA program, and I don't know if it's the same with you, I do start I'm not a Lishite, but I do start with the idea that if something's uncomfortable, because many of my students say, I can't write this, it's too uncomfortable, or it's too revealing of my parents, what will they say? I have a lot of immigrant students who come to my class and say, I don't want to be disowned. I come from a very tight family background. I can't write about this. But, that's what everybody from a marginalized culture has always thought. That's what Ralph Ellison probably went through when he was writing Invisible Man, or Philip Roth when he was writing, anything Philip Roth ever wrote.
Yeah. Oh, I think we have time for one final question. So from Heather, it's a good question. Heather Hanos asks, the collapse of Soviet society, or being Soviet, has informed some of your writing. What can you say about what living in Russian society now might be like, and what writing would it inspire for you, do you think?
Well, Russia has always been a disaster, is a disaster, and will always be a disaster. But the quality of writing that comes out of it is variable. There's some very good Russian writers right now. Sorokin, Vladimir Sorokin comes to mind, Viktor Pelevin, Tatiana Tolstaya. There's a number who are very good. But the golden ages, I think, and maybe there'll be more very good writers, because the golden ages of Russian literature often coincide with immense repression. So the Soviet Union produced Isaac Babel and Solzhenitsyn and Mandelstam and so many other incredible writers. Obviously, the golden age of Tsarist repression produced the Dostoevskys and Turgenevs of Russian literature. I'm often shocked that, for example, Swedish crime noir is a thing, because every time I go to Scandinavia, it seems like such a harmless place. But I guess even there you can find the human animal exists in all these different in any part of the world, no matter what the outward society is like. But Russia is living in the Soviet Union and then moving to a highly politicized country like America taught me that there's always 2 modes of being. There's the private mode of being, and then there's the public mode of being, and they're very important to both distinguish from them, but also to encompass them in one's work. I feel like this book, even though it's more about friendship, the public mode is in the distance, but it's a very menacing public mode, and that's the public mode of the pandemic and a government's inability to deal with this horror that's killing hundreds of thousands of people, right? So that's the sort of Soviet prism. And to me, you know, the last administration felt very Soviet in a way, because it was based almost entirely on promulgating lies. I mean, I remember as a child sitting on the television screen, you know, watching, you know, the country at this point was running out of wheat. There wasn't enough wheat to go around. In fact, I and my fellow Soviet Jews were traded for wheat and high technology. Jimmy Carter sent wheat. We were called grain Jews because we were exchanged for grain. But I remember as a child, right before I was exchanged for that grain, watching, you know, news programs in the Soviet Union that said, you know, grain harvest is at an all-time high. You know, we've overfulfilled the grain, the 5-year grain plan by 700%. You know, so all that to me was fascinating, and watching it come to America in the form, and other countries as well, through the form of, you know, these various Murdoch outlets was fascinating, because it felt exactly like almost a return to the former Soviet Union.
So at 8 or 9 years old, you knew it was a lie.
Well, my parents told me that it was a lie. Once we landed in America, they said, you can't worship, because like all little Russian boys, I worshiped Lenin. I wanted to join the Red Army. And when we got here, they said, you can't worship Lenin anymore. You have to worship Ronald Reagan. So we're going to all make that switch now. And, you know, and that's how we do it.
Wow. That's amazing. That's a great place to stop, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Wow. Well, thank you, Darin, for leading such a great conversation. Thank you, Gary, for joining us this evening, and congratulations on publication. And for those of you, oh, you're very welcome. It's lovely to have you. And for those of you who have not got a copy of Our Country Friends, we can highly recommend it. Please visit oblongbooks.com to get your signed copy. And before we sign off, I'd also like to express our thanks to Melissa Folds, Carrie Neal, Lara Fan, and the team at Penguin Random House who helped make this event possible. So thank you again, Darin and Gary, and thanks to all of you who took time out of your evening to join us. Good night.
Cheers.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.